The top-down topic webs, they are a visual representation of the big picture. They're sort of the skeleton of what it is that students are learning about. And what makes them different than other types of webs is that they represent main ideas in a hierarchy. They show those connections that we talked about earlier that the human brain craves. They move from broad to specific, and they're quite versatile. Now, there are many graphic organizers out there, like we talked about earlier, but the problem is there are many graphic organizers out there. If you went home tonight and Googled graphic organizers to help my students comprehend, you'd come up with 80,000 of them. So we have to pick some that are quite versatile and work well and use them with great consistency. And in this case, you'll see that the top-down web is quite versatile, it's customizable, and it shows those main idea connections that are so crucial for students comprehending and retaining the material that we're teaching them. And when you think about that phrase that we talked about earlier around main idea, and main idea is really being able to see the forest through the trees, the top-down webs are all about capturing that. A lot of times as we move activity to activity in our classrooms, as a middle school history teacher, I used to feel this way. Students would come in and we'd do all these great activities and lessons about the American Revolution. And by day 9, the kids would do a great activity with M&Ms, and they would have to pay up M&Ms like taxes if they had blue eyes. And it was all about taxation without representation. And then I think when they came back the next day, they were wondering if they were going to get M&Ms again. They weren't really sure what this was all anchored in. And when I would ask them the next day, who can tell us about taxation without representation? Students would raise their hands and they would say, is this like the same war, Mrs. Cotty? And I'd say, yes, this is still the same war. We're still in the American Revolution. But I think by the time they rotate period to period, grade to grade, class to class, they don't even realize what unit they're still in. They just function in those daily activities that we have. So the top-down webs are about capturing and anchoring them over and over again in that big picture. Now, it's not a brainstorm web. A brainstorm web sort of springs out from the middle, and they can be great for brainstorming. But when you make a top-down web, it's a very thoughtful map of what is the broadest idea, and it moves down to the most specific. It's a hierarchy of main ideas. It's not just a web or any web. It's a very specific web. A top-down web moves in a hierarchy of main ideas. Now, position, shape, and color matter greatly. I know this seems simple, but it must be explicitly taught to students, and you as the teacher must be really aware of how you are modeling how to do this. So, for example, if you think about the ovals that are up here, if you look at the top-down web on the left, and you have all those ovals, it does something. But if you separate those into rectangles and ovals, and you change your shape at each level, it does something for the human brain. It immediately does something for the eye. It helps you separate main idea more clearly. And you want to be explicit about this with students. Otherwise, they change shape just to change shape, right? Especially middle school kids, especially middle school girls. They'll make a heart, and then a star, and then a rainbow, because they saw that you changed shape. So you have to teach them that a shape changes because a level of main idea changes. And let me also add that I don't want you to have your writing floating in space. So if you write causes of the revolution, put a box around it. So we always want to have shape, period, and then we want to change shape at different levels. Now, to add to that, color does amazing things for the human brain, for retention, for understanding. And when you look at the slide on the right, you see that you can chunk color horizontally, or you can chunk it vertically. It depends on your purpose and your objective. But the use of color further emphasizes separation of main ideas. Now, we work in public ed, so having access to color ink and color copiers often is not at our disposal. But I encourage you to do something simple, such as get a big box of colored pencils and have them in your room. Ask students maybe to contribute. But if you're doing a web and you say to students, grab 3 colors for our web today, it becomes a really great way as they review material and study that those ideas can be separated by color for them. Now, stacking shapes is another point to make with students. We're often working with 8x11 paper here. So in this example, you'll see, if I had my 3 ovals and I started to spring many examples out horizontally, it wouldn't look right. And you want this to stay a strong visual representation. So if you stack your main ideas with the same shape, you can continue the idea that the main idea level has not changed. And again, I can't emphasize enough that these little things, these small tweaks, color, the use of shape, stacking, if you do this yourself and you pass out webs to students, they don't just intuit how to do it. Some of them will, but it's going to be the minority. So as you do this yourself and you pass out your examples and the ones you've created, you have to be very explicit with students why you changed the shape, what colors you chose and why, so that over time you're modeling that expectation so that in time they can begin to create these themselves and use all those little things, color, shape, stacking, appropriately and effectively. Now, subwebs, just as a refresher, when a top-down web is becoming too busy, it becomes counterproductive. The top-down web is not the place for you to put every single detail from your unit or every detail from the article if you're making a top-down web about the article. It's the core. But sometimes, even when you're making the core, you see that an area is becoming too detailed. So we begin to talk about subwebs. These are small webs that can be developed using the bigger web as your springboard. An example, if you look at volcanoes and earthquakes, if I sprung off to the beneath the earth section and I started to think about, well, I actually want to give my students examples of liquid rocks and solid plates. If I started putting 3 and 4 examples under each of those, the web is becoming too busy. So I've pulled off to do a separate beneath the earth web that serves as a subweb with more information in it. Now, you don't have to do subwebs. You could say, this is what I want on my web, and my detail will come in my 2-column notes later. That's fine. But if the web is too detailed and you really think a visual web of the next piece is best, you need to move to a subweb rather than having an extremely busy overall web. This example I love because it shows a student making this independently in her own math notebook. And what you'll notice is the student has really been taught the nitty-gritties of webs over time. Because in this example, you notice that the student is changing their shape. They're moving from circle to square to the bubble shape. And then as a certain idea around mean, median, mode is becoming more detailed, the student moves to a subweb and even calls it a subweb. So the idea over time is that students can begin to map their thinking in these top-down webs and take ownership of how to lay out ideas and represent their understanding with real independence.